So this week's prompt night couldn't be more perfect for the topic and the country we're going to discuss today, right? Surf is a new social platform from the makers of Flipboard. Did you ever use Flipboard much? Are you a Flipboard user?
Yeah. No, I used Flipboard a bunch back in the day, and it sort of fell off. But I will say I have been playing around with Surf because I had beta access to it from a while ago, but it was just released today. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a brand new social app. It allows kind of users to make feeds and to follow other people who make feeds. So you can kind of think of it as like souped up hashtag pages if you're a kind of Twitter user back in the day. That's a bit of an oversimplification, but it's a bet on the famous hashtag. And anyway, we're going to use the Surf prompt as the start of today's podcast. And you've already done this, I think, on the platform, Mike, but it asks users to make a feed about. So what are you going to make a feed about?
Well, the thing I was going to say is I spent last weekend at the Atmosphere Conference, and there was so much energy about what is going on in the open social web, and that is part of what Surf is enabling. And so I would make a feed about some of the very exciting new developments and new services and incredible creativity that came out of my experience last weekend. What about you, Ben? What would you make a feed about?
I would probably make a feed about how to stay calm during a house renovation project. I'm back on the house renovation train, Mike.
Oh, no.
It's bad. It's real bad. I'm kind of doing the podcast surrounded by rubble and with dust swirling around me. It's a hell of a time. But, we plow on. And if anyone has any kind of house renovation tips, get in touch with us. I'm all for it. I'm going to need them over the next couple of weeks. Hello and welcome to Ctrl-Alt-Speech, your weekly roundup of major stories about online speech, content moderation, and internet regulation. It's April the 2nd, 2026, and this week we're talking about how the Australia social media ban is going, why an EU vote potentially puts children at risk, and more content moderation shenanigans from two major platform CEOs. My name is Ben Whitelaw. I'm the founder and editor of Everything Moderation, and I'm in the chair with Mike Masnick, founder of TechDirt, and recently back from a trip across the border to Canada.
Yeah, they let me back into the country, Ben.
You didn't get left out in the cold.
No. Everything worked fine. It was funny when I landed in Canada and I texted my wife that they let me in, and she said, "Go seek asylum."
Which hopefully says nothing about the state of your marriage.
Right. Well, she's looking out for me. But no, I didn't have any problems getting into either Canada or then back into the United States. I did have problems on flights. I had connecting flights, and basically all four of my flights, both there and back, had some sort of problem. So it was kind of a rough trip all around. But, I made it out of the country and back in to lovely Canada. Canada is wonderful. Vancouver is wonderful. It's the first time I've been to Vancouver, and it's a very nice city. And it was great. The conference was held at the university there, which is a little bit sort of outside the city or on the edge of the city, basically, a little bit separated from it. But beautiful campus, beautiful event. Really wonderful discussions, and it was really energizing. I mean, there have been a bunch of people who've written up their takes on the Atmosphere Conference. And just for folks who don't know, the Atmosphere Conference is it's basically a developer conference about @protocol, which is the underlying protocol that powers Blue Sky. Ding, ding, ding. I am on the board of Blue Sky. But the really neat thing about the conference, honestly, was that very little of the discussion was about Blue Sky. I was noting on Saturday that we went hours without anyone even mentioning Blue Sky at all. Almost all of the discussion is about amazing things different developers are doing that are totally unrelated to Blue Sky. People are building, just a better internet using the @protocol.
What was the big one that you thought, okay, this is cool? Like when I wrote the paper back and whenever it was, I didn't expect to see this appear.
Oh man, there's so much. It's almost hard to describe, but there's definitely Streamplace is the big video streaming platform that has been around for a little while. It's been really successful, and they're launching video on demand now. So rather than just streaming being more like Twitch, they're now going to start to do YouTube. So they actually were set up and they filmed every talk at the conference and are now putting them up on their new video on demand platform. That's really cool. there was like somebody had hacked together literally days before the event this app called You and Me, which became really popular at the conference, which was as you met someone, you would open your You and Me app and you would scan each other's thing and it would bring up their @protocol profile and it would say, oh, these two people met. And so you could track how many people you met. Some people got very competitive about it. I missed out, but I saw people were like running around like, oh, I haven't scanned you yet, So there
Pokemon style.
Yeah, there was that. There were just a bunch of like really creative stuff, people thinking through all different things. You had a lot of talk about long form content, so there's like blogging and newsletters. There were people talking about, specific areas of building communities, smaller communities, larger communities. It was just all sorts of creative thinking about how do you build tools on this open protocol. And it really was very exciting.
Great. And Surf, actually, which we started the episode with, is actually kind of built on or pulls in content from various kind of federated platforms, right?
Yeah, Surf is really cool in that it builds on @proto, but also ActivityPub, which is what powers Mastodon, and RSS, which is like the old school syndication side of things. And so Surf is cool because it, pull in content from all of those in a way that you don't have to know. Like if you just create an account on Surf and, you can build feeds that pulls in content from all of these things. And it just becomes like a way to consume and follow different kinds of content on different kinds of topics, including videos that bring in YouTube videos as well. So what's cool is like people are beginning to realize like there are ways to do cool things on the internet. A lot of people kept talking about how it reminds them of the early days of the internet itself. People were trying to figure out how do you build websites. And these are still websites and apps that people are building, but with this social protocol layered on top of it, which begins to open up new fun possibilities, like being able to, scan each other's badges and stuff. And even the tickets to the conference themselves, the schedule and the tickets were built on @protocol. So to get your badge, you log in with your account, and then it shows on your account. And now on the account, in my PDS, in my collection of data, which I control and can move to any other server, it says that I attended the Atmosphere conference. It's,
nice.
So all this data is under your control. You can begin to do really cool things with it. So there's a lot of fun, creative thinking.
Yeah.
And it was really, really exciting. We also saw, there were a bunch of people always talk about Blue Sky because it's the biggest, but we're seeing like other ones like Black Sky has gotten larger and larger. Eurosky, I think, has now surpassed Black Sky and how many users they have on Eurosky. There's North Sky as well. So we're seeing other parts of the ecosystem growing and, showing what you can do when you have an open protocol. So
what's North Sky? People who like or live in the north of the country they live in?
It's a Canadian-based service, but it's not just for Canadians, as I understand it. I believe it's really focused on making sure that LGBTQ folks are welcome on a platform and that it's designed with that community in mind and being very supportive and welcoming. And they're building in some other features. They've sort of plowed ahead very quickly with trying to do permission data, which is the private data, which is something that Blue Sky has not done yet, which again is one of these things about having an open protocol is that is extensible, is that other people can build on it. And there was a lot of talk about building out permission data and how it's going to be done. And North Sky is one of the services that's kind of leading the way there. It's just like all sorts of creativity and people willing to hack and build and create and not locked into some silo that is evil CEOs control, as we will be talking about later in the podcast. But it was it was really like everybody was kind of buzzing. I mean, almost all the conversations I had with people were excited. There was this excitement that hasn't been around on the internet in a little while.
Yeah, that's great. So it was very hopeful. Sounds very, very positive. Did you get stopped from any selfies?
No selfies, I think, but there were. I mean, a lot of people knew who I was, which was an interesting experience. It was nice to meet a lot of people who I'd interacted with online and to have conversations with people that I only knew online. And, it was a jam-packed event where there were 3 different tracks going on all at once. And going through the schedule was impossible because basically out of every time slot, I would definitely want to go to at least 2 out of 3 of the sessions, and usually 3 out of the 3 sessions. And then there was a whole hallway track where you're just like skipping sessions and just talking to people in the hallways. And so, I just kept running into people, meeting people, or people wanted to talk to me about this or that thing. So it was nice. A couple people were like, does it feel weird to be at this conference that sort of could be traced back to a thing that you just wrote, and with all these people and all this stuff going on? And yes, that is very weird.
But nice, I imagine. Very nice. I mean, talking of online interactions, to move on from the conference experience, we had a couple of Spotify comments this week.
Oh, good.
And they weren't, not loads, but they weren't as nice as people were in person at the conference.
Well, we got mean comments.
Well, not mean so much, but people kind of, I think, took umbrage with your critique of the Meta trials last week. So we did a great episode. You were on good form, I'd say, about the California and New Mexico trials that occupied a lot of the news agenda last week. And one of the comments said, "Wow, good thing Masnick wasn't on the jury."
Okay.
Which somebody else stuck up for you, in fairness.
Okay.
But
I mean, they would have kicked me off the jury so fast. I mean, come on. I've gone through jury selection process, and I know I wouldn't have made the cut.
Yeah, okay. So it's wishful thinking on the part of the commenter. But anyway, good to get some comments. We had a couple of emails as well saying that it was a great episode. Thanks everyone for listening. And obviously get in touch with us at podcast@Ctrl-Alt-Speech.com. Rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. As ever, we are seeing a growing number of listeners, and that's all in part to you spreading the word, getting the word out there about the podcast, and sending us lots of your feedback and your thoughts. We have a lot to get through, Mike, this week, as ever. We kind of spent more time than usual, I think, figuring out what to talk about this week, because there's a whole lot. Yeah. And we're taking, after a very US-focused episode last week, we're taking a step away from the US. We're covering Australia and also the EU in various forms. We're going to start in Australia, where obviously surfing is a very well-known, there's my link, very well-known pastime.
Segues.
But another pastime that has kind of sprung up over the last few months is checking if your child is still on social media when they shouldn't be. The social media ban that came into effect on December the 10th last year has been a long-running story, and it's a piece of regulation that's now being copied around the world. So it's very interesting this week to have a new report come out on the first 3 months of the enforcement of the ban. And you've gone through it in fine detail, Mike, to bring us the best of it and save our listeners the hassle.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. The e-safety commissioner, I think they're required to put out reports on it, but it's sort of looking at the compliance. And it's kind of funny to read, I think, in that basically they're admitting that it's not really working, but they're trying to put a happy face on it, and both a happy face and a threatening face, right? Because they sort of admit, like, it seems that, okay, a bunch of accounts were banned, and it is harder for kids to create new accounts, but there's still a ton of kids on these platforms, and that's bad, and that needs to stop. And there's this vague sort of threatening, like, we've started investigations into various platforms, and we're going to start to ramp up our pressure on platforms that we think are not actually doing enough to keep under 16 kids from accessing the content. I'll mention that there was another study recently, just a few weeks ago, that I had written about, that was using sort of external data to try and figure out how many people under 16 still had accounts. And they actually said, like, there is a dip, but it looked like the equivalent of the dip at the end of summer, like kids log off to go back to school or whatever. And so they said, there was a dip, but it was not like a major dip.
Right.
And so I think that is sort of reflected in some of this report. It's almost a passive-aggressive report, I think,
right,
in some ways, in that it's trying to play up like, oh, yeah, we're hearing all these good things and kids are getting banned, but also it feels like kids are getting through. Some of the things that stood out to me, beyond the fact that they're just like basically like, hey, now we're going to get serious and we're really going to start to crack down, was they went through these like key observations about how kids were remaining on the platforms, or really how the platforms were not doing enough to keep kids off the platforms. And these struck me as bad, like not really dealing with the nuances related here. So like They were complaining that kids who had signed up for platforms before the ban went into effect, who had indicated that they were under 16, were then urged to undergo age assurance in the lead up to it. And to me, that sounds understandable. But the e-safety commissioner is complaining because they said, oh, well, because when this person signed up, they said they were this age, you should assume that they are that age, that they are under 16, and your nudge to get them to go do age assurance is really a nudge to try and get them around the ban, because they have this example of someone who signed up and said they were 14, and then it pushed them to do age assurance, which did a face scan, and the face scan said you're 16, so it let them stay. So the e-safety commissioner's argument is like, oh, this is a route around it. But it's like, no, I mean, you push them to do age assurance. They did age assurance. The fact that the age assurance didn't work, just like so many people warned you that that technology is not that good, I don't think you fault the platforms for that. That just feels wrong.
Yeah. I mean, that feels like there's a bit of exceptionalism there.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, you're right that you can't have it both ways, first of all. You put a ban in place, the platforms are going to put a bunch of age assurance, age verification in. There's going to be some people who, as we all know, evade that in various ways. But there is, in all of the reporting and kind of analysis about the ban so far, I feel there's just been this kind of exceptionalism where people find individuals who've evaded the ban. Either journalists speak to them directly and they kind of say without much evidence, yeah, I'm on TikTok or I'm on Snapchat or I'm sending, messages to my friends, or they find a parent, or in this case, they find somebody who's evaded the ban with the help of some quite poor age verification technology, it sounds like. And this report doesn't really add much in my sense. It still feels quite exceptional. It doesn't feel very grounded in data. There is this big number of 4.7 million accounts that the platforms have prevented access for under 16s, but it still feels very early, doesn't it, to kind of be drawing too many conclusions.
And it gets back to the whole impossibility theorem concept here, where there's like this assumption that, well, if the platforms aren't doing it perfectly, clearly they're making mistakes. Like one of the other examples was they said, if someone fails an age assurance test, some of the platforms allow them to try again. And it's just like, well, yeah, because the technology is not good. You can't do a one and done with this kind of weak technology. And yet they act like that's some sort of big scandal. The other thing that bugs me about this is it heavily relies on parental surveys. They did parental surveys and parents are saying, oh yeah, my kid still has access to like certain platforms or whatever. Yeah. But do we know that's true? Are they just saying that? What do they mean? And also because the system is, for like YouTube, for example, you can still watch YouTube videos in Australia if you're under 16, you just can't have an account. Yeah. So do parents know the difference? Do kids know the difference between that? Do parents know the difference between that? So if a kid is just watching YouTube without an account, but you ask that parent or even the kid, they're probably going to say, yeah, I still have an account because they're still watching YouTube. And so there are distinctions here that I think the numbers are a little bit unclear. The one set of numbers that I did think was interesting and to me was a little bit of a surprise, and they admitted, that there were concerns raised that children who are under the age of 16 who were facing abuse or threats or harassment or something else, some sort of problematic thing online, were not going to report it because of fear that, I'm going to be discovered as being under 16 on these platforms, I'm going to lose my access. So there were concerns raised that it would lead to fewer reports of abuse, which could be really dangerous. The e-safety commissioner, they don't give numbers, so I don't know for sure, but they indicate that the reporting amounts seem about the same, that there hasn't been a noticeable change in the number of reports of cyberbullying or whatever. So maybe that's like one hopeful takeaway from this, but I still feel like I would imagine that there still are kids who won't report stuff because of this very reason.
Yeah. Yeah, that's another potential kind of unintended consequence, which, again, research and better analysis of data will bear out, I guess, over time. I don't think it's just the survey that causes me concerns in terms of this report, Mike, but it's the research methodologies more generally. The parent survey is one of them, but also everything else feels quite kind of potentially cherry-picked. They use public reporting from media and researchers. We know what media is like when it comes to reporting on issues that we talk about each week. There is some desktop research and testing of platforms by the E-Safety Commission themselves. You're only going to kind of look for I guess, particular instances. There is other web forms that have been completed by parents or users. Again, they're all kind of surfacing the exceptional circumstances, I guess.
Yes.
And you're probably not seeing the average experience of most under 16s here.
And there are other reports too. There was a report, I think it was maybe about a month ago, in particular looking at disabled teenagers who had, relied on various communities on social media and had lost access to those. And that seemed very serious, and it was deeply reported and a worrisome finding. And this report doesn't touch on that at all, doesn't mention anything about, there is something about trying to provide resources for kids who are upset by losing their account, which is not the same thing as what that report from a few weeks ago was talking about. Like, the way it's presented in this report is basically like, those addicted kids who can't handle losing their Instagram or whatever. But no, like the report from a few weeks ago were like people who really relied on the communities that they had built. And this report doesn't deal with that at all. It doesn't address it even remotely.
Yeah. And this report is, again, the E-Safety Commission should be commended for putting this out and being transparent about the information.
Absolutely.
It's not just a kind of exercise in sharing information, though. What they've said as a result of the kind of analysis that they've done is that they're now going to bring enforcement cases against 5 platforms of the 10 that were being under the regime in the first place: Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, and YouTube. And they're in the process of deciding what that enforcement looks like. So within the next couple of months, Mike, we might see enforcement against those 5 platforms for a failure to essentially kind of make reasonable adjustments to how the platforms work for children, which, again, feels very quick to be doing that, I must say.
Yeah. And to me, it also sort of demonstrates the problem, because this comes up in internet-related laws all over the world, this reasonableness standard, because reasonable is a very subjective term. And it's basically like, if anything happens that we don't like, we can go after you. And I think we're seeing that. Like, okay, it's only been a few months and they're saying some of these platforms are not being reasonable. And I already described, some of the examples where I think I find it again, you don't want me on the jury, so, I have my positions on these things. But again, like if you require age blocking and then you complain about a platform offering age assurance to someone that they think may or may not be underage, like that strikes me as a reasonable approach. And for the E-Safety Commission to come out and say that's not a reasonable approach, it seems like, it's basically like, get everything right or we're going to come and do enforcement. And that doesn't seem like a good system.
Yeah. In fact, in one of the key points of the report very early on, there's a bullet that kind of admits to this question of like reasonableness being vague.
Yes.
And it says basically reasonableness is a question for the courts to decide once we present the evidence to them. So there is an acknowledgement, I think, that is the direction that this social media ban is going. There is going to be enforcement against probably at least one of these platforms in the course of the next 6 months or so. And that will be a thing for the courts to decide. So I think we can already see the direction of this, Mike, which means we will probably return to it on a future episode of the podcast.
I am sure that the experiment that is happening down under will be a repeat focus of the podcast going forward.
Yes, exactly. Let's kind of go on to matters in the EU now. I think, Mike, when we talk about stories on the podcast, they always do one of two things. I think they kind of explain or break down a big story that has been in the news but maybe isn't covered in as much depth as we'd like, or they kind of surface stories that maybe people haven't heard of, or perhaps us mentioning them or talking about them as a starting point. And I think this second story is in the second category. It's something that hasn't got a lot of coverage. I know you've written about it this week, but it feels incredibly important, very relevant to our listeners. It's also something that came up a lot in the Trust and Safety Summit that I attended last week. I was caught in the hallway with a bunch of people who said, you haven't really talked about this story that's kind of consuming a lot of me and my team's time and energy. Are you aware of it? And it has been kind of bubbling on my radar, but actually this week it really became very, very important. So let's talk a bit about the CSAM in Europe. And many of our listeners will know about kind of hash matching. Let's start there. Hash matching being the kind of digital fingerprinting that allows platforms to share CSAM in a way that can be taken down or removed to avoid users being harmed. And that is a technology that has worked well for a long period of time. There are various databases that platforms feed into in order to create as much of a centralized database of CSAM as possible. And that allows CSAM to be removed at the rate it has. I didn't know, Mike, but actually in the EU, that process, that kind of voluntary removal of CSAM is enabled by an exemption to the e-privacy directive, often known as the cookie law.
Yes. Well, actually, most people blame the GDPR for cookies, even though you're right. It's actually the e-privacy directive, which is why you have to deal with the cookies. Yes.
Yeah. So and this kind of voluntary system has been enabled by basically an exemption to this law, which has been extended over a number of years. And again, I have no idea about this, despite being in the EU nominally and reading
at
about
some point.
Yeah, in the not too distant past. But it was extended last in 2024, and since then there has been a process to create a more permanent framework for child safety in Europe. And so we have this kind of two-track process going on, where the extension is kind of looming, but actually at the same time, European MEPs are trying to create a permanent solution that balances privacy and child safety in a way that is set up for the future. And this has been going on. And last Thursday, which was just when we were kind of wrapping up the conference, there was a big vote, what was called a Hail Mary vote, for another extension of this exemption to the e-privacy directive. And it did not pass, right? So all of a sudden, you have a situation where platforms are in a very, very difficult position. They either have to scan for CSAM and it be illegal in the EU, or they have to kind of abide by the rules but not scan for CSAM and potentially be liable for privacy violations under this directive. What a terrible position to be in. And as of tomorrow, April the 3rd, that is when the exemption kind of runs out, the current exemption. So platforms as of tomorrow will either have to pick one of those paths. And this is what was kind of really getting some of the trust and safety professionals at this conference in a rage, was like, how am I meant to decide? What do you expect me to do? How has it come to this point? You know, how much have you kind of been following this in TechDirt's coverage over the last months and years?
Yeah, I have been following it. And I did write about this week also. This is one of those genuinely, like, there are no good answers. There are no easy answers here. There are challenges across the board, some of which we struggle with in the US, but the European situation is really, really tricky. So what you really have, and it's important to break down, there are trade-offs to every approach, right? The e-privacy directive is designed to try and protect privacy of people in the EU. And as part of that, it makes it difficult for companies to scan private communications and private data. And at a first pass, you're like, yeah, that seems good. That seems like something that most people would want to support. But then you have the flip side, which is that, as we all know, any network that has any kind of ability, especially for private data, eventually gets used for CSAM. And that's why we've built up these giant, hash matching tools and other tools to scan for, to identify, to quarantine, and to, notify the various reporting groups around the world, the most famous being the cyber tip line in the US, but other countries have similar things. There are these systems that are generally considered to be voluntary and cooperative between platforms, tip lines, and law enforcement that allows them to identify this stuff. And if there is a law enforcement issue, if someone is being abused or someone is being abusive, to allow law enforcement to go deal with that. And there are different responses in terms of how well that works. We've reported on, NCMEC and the cyber tip line in the US getting overwhelmed with bad reports or not having the right information, and law enforcement not having the resources to actually deal with these things. All of that is true. But there are also reports of these tip lines and the cooperation system being useful for law enforcement to actually go after real perpetrators. So you have to figure out a way to balance those things. In the US, the balance is very fragile, and there are attempts to break it. But in the US, it's voluntary, right? They can't put into law that a platform has to scan, because if they do, if it's at the behest of the government, then it's covered by the Fourth Amendment, which means that you need to have a warrant which requires probable cause before you can do the search. And if you do require it and you haven't gotten a warrant, that means the remedy for that is that the evidence is excluded. So if you required platforms in the US to do scans, then you would basically make that evidence useless in court, which would be really bad, right? If they found evidence of abuse and then that couldn't be used in court, that would be bad. Yeah. This is why currently there's a private lawsuit going on about this, a class action lawsuit that's trying to force Apple to scan, and a separate lawsuit in West Virginia that is claiming that Apple should be required to scan iCloud storage, both of which would create massive Fourth Amendment problems. But this situation in the EU is kind of the reverse, which is that you have privacy activists claiming that, no, this exemption for scanning is bad, and we want the e-privacy directive to stand as it does without that exemption, and the company shouldn't be allowed to do general scanning without direct suspicion. And, there's a part of me that's like, I tend to agree with the privacy advocates on lots of things, and I see that, and I see certainly the slippery slope concern of when you have an apparatus in place that allows you to scan all your storage and communications, usually that doesn't remain focused on just one item, but can become a much broader scan and much broader surveillance, which would not be good.
Yeah. I think the issue for me, and I get it, it's very complex, is that there wasn't a kind of solution ready. And so the MEPs have kind of pushed forward with obviously a more permanent framework. And according to people I've spoken to, actually, the way that the vote happened and the timescales from late last year that the extension votes took place were designed to force an agreement on the permanent framework.
Yeah.
So there was a kind of emphasis on getting a permanent framework sorted. What that's led to is this now gap. So kind of procedurally...
The failure to have anything. Yes, yeah.
Right. It's kind of procedurally, I can see that you want to move towards a world in which privacy and child safety are kind of aligned in a framework that everyone kind of understands and the platforms can kind of take and use. What it has meant in practice is now there's going to be a gap where platforms are in a kind of limbo, in a bit of a no man's land. The other thing that I don't think covers the EU political system in glory is that there are actually two votes that took place, one for a clean extension to the e-privacy directive and one for a more narrower version of it, I guess, as they move towards that permanent framework, which doesn't allow platforms to be as broad in their scanning. And they both passed. And because they both passed, there was no cohesive position and it kind of collapsed. You can't move forward, right? So if anything, that shows the kind of complexities and the different views within the commission about what to be done. But on the ground, people are saying that this is going to make their lives very difficult. It's going to put them in a position where actually, they might not be able to protect children as much as they would like on their platforms, which is obviously not what no one wants.
Yeah. It's definitely a tricky situation where there's no perfect answer, like many things related to online trust and safety, especially when it comes to child safety in particular. There are serious trade-offs that different people can come down and weigh the different trade-offs in different ways. The procedural stuff, I mean, they've been arguing over this for years, trying to find a permanent solution. And I can understand the people who are tired of just kicking the can down the road every time and saying okay, just extend the exemption for a longer period of time. But, then we're in this situation right now. And it's they can still scan, but they could face liability depending on what comes out of the scan, or people could sue over it, which means for the most part, they probably will stop the scanning. And that's probably not a good situation. If you're familiar with anyone who works in child safety stuff, I think generally speaking, this is not a good scenario for the EU.
No, but it has happened before. I was reading up on how this had kind of essentially a similar thing happened in 2021. And there was a 7-month gap between having the extension amended. And so, again, platforms had to take the risk of whether they scanned or didn't scan. And one of the only ways you can tell what the effect of that is that there was a decline in the number of reports to NECMEC.
Yeah.
National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children. And that was significant. It was 58%. So you had a situation where there was fewer reports coming through the system. And without the pipeline, it's impossible to be able to then address any serious issues from law enforcement's perspective. So I get the issues on all sides, but it's a really tough one, a really difficult situation for everyone.
Yep.
So let's go now to our roundup, Mike. We're going to do a bit of a roundup that kind of relates back to some old episodes of Ctrl-Alt-Speech. There's a glut of stories and interesting reads this week that relate to things we've covered in the past or people we've spoken about. And we're going to start by talking a bit about our good friend, our long-standing punching bag at Ctrl-Alt-Speech, Mark Zuckerberg. You wrote a bit about him this week and some texts he's been sending to his pals.
Yeah. So this was kind of funny and somewhat random almost because it came out of the lawsuit that Elon Musk has filed against OpenAI, which is a whole other issue, which we're not even going to go into the details of what is happening in that lawsuit. But there was a filing where Musk's lawyers were trying to get certain evidence that was pulled during discovery suppressed, and basically saying like OpenAI is basically just looking to embarrass Elon Musk, which, is fun for everybody. But and they were saying all these things are irrelevant to the case. And they showed a few examples of it, some of which are fairly embarrassing to Elon Musk. But one of the examples they showed was a text message exchange between Mark Zuckerberg and Elon, which took place in February of 2025. So soon after the new administration came into effect and Elon Musk was in control of the government, as some of you may remember happened for a few months in the new Trump/Musk administration. And Zuckerberg texted Musk like, hey, I forget the exact phrasing, but basically looks like Doge is coming along great. And just so you know, we're all set up to take down anyone who tries to dox or threaten Doge employees. And so there's a lot of context here that is important. That was just a quick message, and then the exchange went off in other ways. I think Musk liked that. So this came 24 days, because I counted, 24 days after the infamous Joe Rogan appearance, which came just a couple days after Zuckerberg's silly, expensive watch, fancy chain video where he's like, we're done with content moderation. We're getting rid of fact checkers. And, we went too far. And then he went on Rogan and he was like, oh, the Biden administration cursed at us and tried to make us take down content. And we're done with that. And we're never going to remove truthful information again. We don't believe in removing truthful information. 24 days later, he is proactively texting perhaps the most powerful person in the U.S. government saying, we are all set and ready to take down the content that you don't want online. Which, the level of sheer hypocrisy and, just brazen, obnoxious, like the whole Rogan thing was a performance. I wrote 10,000 words on why it was a nonsense performance, but this is just insane. And so some people will push back and say like, well, he said doxing and threatening, like that can't be allowed. But sure, threatening, fine. But doxing, these were public officials who were working for the government. There's no doxing if you name them. The other bit of context here is the day before that came out, before that text message exchange, Wired had published the first of multiple reports that came out of identifying some of the Doge kids, because they were mostly kids. And so it was really about that. Like, oh my gosh, reporters are doing journalism and identifying federal employees who are going through the government and shutting stuff down and pulling funding and doing all this stuff. And journalists were reporting on them, and Zuckerberg is like, please government, like, are you happy? I'm going to remove any information on these guys. And it seems really, really, really bad, first of all, and just completely the opposite of what he was performatively saying on Rogan less than a month earlier. Yeah.
It's so brazen. And it's the text of such a kind of wet, sycophantic CEO, like, oh, it looks like Doge is going well. Like, shut up. Shut up. Stop licking the ass of Elon. Like, you're embarrassing. How could I would be embarrassed if this text came out about me. I honestly would. And like, that doesn't even like take into account the fact that it shows I've got no morals or principles, or, I say one thing in public and do something else in private. Like, all aspects of it are incredibly embarrassing to him.
It wasn't even that long before that they were challenging each other to a cage match duel where they were going to fight each other, right? I mean,
that was embarrassing enough. Like the kind of pent up frustration, the pseudo masculinity of that all, and then to kind of text each other, be like, "Oh, your government work's going well."
Yeah, and I'm going to pull down accounts revealing all the things that you're doing.
Yeah. I mean, it reminded me of the episode we talked about kind of the relationship of media and platforms.
Yes,
you know, here we have a wide journalist doing solid reporting, really good reporting on a platform CEO who also happened to be in the government at the time. And you have another platform CEO puffing out their chest and saying, you know, I will stand up to the journalists for you, Elon.
Yeah.
You know, it just goes to show that these guys can't face any kind of inspection without them crumbling in terms of their morals or values or what it is that they claim to be.
Yeah, it's just ridiculous and obnoxious. And the rest of the text exchange was Elon trying to convince Zuckerberg to join him in trying to buy OpenAI. But the whole thing is just, the whole thing is sickening.
Yeah, gets my goat up. Another CEO who hasn't covered themselves in glory this week has given a fascinating interview with the New York Times. Neil Mohan, his YouTube CEO, has been for a number of years now, and he gives a kind of long and extensive interview to the NYT in which he's asked a number of times about the way that YouTube does content moderation. YouTube is obviously a gigantic platform now. It is bigger than a lot of cable channels. It is viewed actually mostly on TVs, which is a kind of interesting development. So they are everywhere. And part of the reason for doing the interview was because it is such a behemoth now. And so it was very interesting to see him fail to answer the questions about the platform's policies and how it enforces it, and to really get the answers so badly wrong. I don't know if you read this, Mike, but he
did, yeah.
He kind of bodged these answers. He skirts around them. When asked about whether he should have brought back Donald Trump, he makes a whole bunch of like,
it's so bad,
odd statements.
It's so bad. It's someone who is not prepped for that question.
Yeah,
it's so bad. Yeah.
He wanted to talk about creators, and he wanted to talk about kind of growth and Mr. Beast and all the weird stuff that goes on YouTube.
Yeah.
He didn't want to talk about how the trust and safety team decide what goes up and what comes down.
You can tell from the entire interview that all he wants to do is be like, look at Mr. Beast, look at all these cool creators on the platform, look at all this wonderful thing, we're the new TV, blah, blah, blah. And as soon as the interviewer starts asking tough questions about trust and safety, he shuts down. He's clearly not prepared for it. And he's just like, he gives these like, where he's just trying to tap dance around things and just making it worse and worse. And on the Donald Trump question in particular, he keeps going back to like, well, I don't really remember what our policies were back then.
Yeah.
Come on. Like, I'm sorry, but like, that is ridiculous. That is not an acceptable answer. You can take on those things. You can explain why you've changed policies over time. You can explain why you did these things at the time. But to say, I don't remember what the policies were at the time, that is just completely unbelievable as somebody who's clearly tap dancing, because there are some questions after that sort of about the political stuff. And he's, he does what he has to do as a CEO, but in a really, really sketchy way where he's like, we try and work with every administration. We try not to be partisan or whatever. It's like, sure, but that's not what the issue was. It wasn't a partisan issue why all the platforms banned Trump on January 6th or 7th, 2021. Yep. You can talk about what the reasons were, but he doesn't want to do that. He wants to talk about Mr. Beast's latest big challenge or whatever. and this is how CEOs should not be prepared to discuss. They have to be prepared in a much better way than he was. And this is not the first time. We talked about Neil Mohan in an interview before and how ill-prepared he was for questions about trust and safety. Even though at one point in this interview, they asked him about trust and safety. He's like, yeah, actually, that's like my biggest thing every day. But then as soon as they try and get in on details, he just cannot answer them. It's embarrassing.
Yeah, it is. If only you'd listened to the podcast last year, you would have avoided this situation. And the questioning is very good, in fairness. There's questions about, were you ultimately responsible for the return of Donald Trump, in which kind of he is forced to say yes. That's the kind of through line, I think, between the Zuckerberg story that you just talked about and Mohan, is that, there is very often a very senior member of these platforms who are responsible or at least notified of major decisions around content moderation, which I think we almost forget in the melee of all of these stories every week. And also the journalist asks about Candace Owens, the kind of MAGA far right commentator / conspiracy theorist, and like makes a case of her. She's like growing fast on the platform, but she's spouting a lot of misinformation, and he really gets put on the spot about that. So, I really respect the kind of level of questioning on this interview. Is definitely worth reading. We'll include it in the show notes as usual.
Or you can watch it on YouTube, as he himself notes.
I doubt he'll be watching that back. I'll be surprised. So yeah, we'll also link to the episode that Mike referred to, in which we critiqued his last performance in the media last year, and we'll include a few other episodes that might be worth returning to if you're interested. One of the kind of other stories that is worth talking about, Mike, is, again, a story we discussed last year in our episode Rated R for Ridiculous, about Meta moving forward with a film-style rating system. That is no longer. They've pulled the plug.
Well, they came to an agreement with the Motion Picture Association. And the agreement is basically like Meta and Instagram will no longer refer to their rating system as PG-13, which they had really already stopped doing. I think back in December, they kind of really pulled the plug on it. But, the MPA was effectively threatening them with a trademark lawsuit about this. So they came to an agreement. They put out a public statement through the MPA. Look, this whole thing was silly. I mean, it was silly when we talked about it last year. The rating system, again, was like this kludge that the movie studios, it's funny, like there is one sort of thing that I do think is kind of funny, was that the whole reason why Hollywood put this framework in place was because they were being threatened by government officials about the kinds of movies that they were putting out, that they were harmful for children. And so they put together this system of ratings to sort of appease everyone and to avoid regulation. Does that sound familiar? Right?
Do you think, I know that there's this kind of trademark dispute, do you think kind of the MPA should have allowed the platforms to use the system? As part of the kind of broader mission of, like, as you say, being clear about what information contains, being, keeping people safe, making sure that people understand what they're watching.
I don't know. I mean, again, all of this was so stupid because like the rating system works for movies and it has like this whole like parent council, which is notoriously arbitrary and extremely prude. And the reason Instagram used this in the first place is just because lots of people understand it conceptually. What is a PG-13 movie versus what is not? And so they were sort of building off of that general knowledge, but in a very different context where it doesn't really apply conceptually in the same way. And so on the trademark side of it specifically, like, I don't think people were confused, which is a necessary part of trademark infringement for the most part. There are some exceptions to that, but I don't think anyone thought that Meta was like going to the MPA and having them rate kids posting videos on themselves doing stupid stunts in the same way that they were like, they're rating the latest blockbuster film. And so I don't think that you had like a legitimate issue of confusion, which is what trademark is supposed to deal with. Mm-hmm. But, Instagram never should have done this in the first place, and the MPA shouldn't have freaked out about it on their side. So the fact that they settled and basically they're just going back to the way things were before, it's fine. It's over. It was a silly spat.
Yeah. Would it differ if it was YouTube that decided to kind of implement PG-13? Because we just...
That is an interesting one. I could see a stronger complaint from the MPA if YouTube started using that same rating system, because the YouTube experience is somewhat closer to what the watching movie experience is. And of course, YouTube now has lots of movies on their platform. They're, licensed and everything. And so I could see it being a clearer issue there. I also tend to think, maybe this is unfair, but I tend to think that the lawyers at Google and YouTube would not have allowed that to happen in the first place as opposed to Meta, which is maybe...
What makes you say that?
Just a general statement on the quality of the legal team at both companies. And I'm wondering if I'm going to get emails about this.
If somebody listened to the podcast long enough to get that little insight, you've done well. You've stuck around, and yeah, I will look forward to hearing next week whether you get any emails. In fact, it would have to be 2 weeks' time because you're not going to be here next week.
Yes,
you're traveling.
I'm back on the road again. I am constantly on the road, so we will have a special guest host next week with you. But I will be back in 2 weeks.
Great. Well, that brings us to an end this week, Mike. thanks to all the outlets we have used this week in our coverage. Couldn't have done it without them. New York Times, the famous Tech Dirt, Crikey in Australia. Go and read their stories via our show notes and support their work where you can. That's all us for this week. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you all soon.
Thanks for listening to Ctrl-Alt-Speech. Subscribe now to get our weekly episodes as soon as they're released. If your company or organization is interested in sponsoring the podcast, contact us by visiting Ctrl-Alt-Speech.com. That's Ctrl-Alt-Speech.com.